Hi, everyone. Welcome to ANT 105 for week 2. Now, this week, the reading and the material is really focused on defining what archaeology is. A very simple definition would involve the study of the past using material remains. But what the textbook and what the videos from this week highlight is that archaeology is a very dynamic and broad topic that we could talk of the reconstruction of the past. We can also talk about a scientific approach. And then one of the most important understandings of archaeology is as a field within anthropology. And when I talk about anthropology, I talk about the study of human diversity. And that means human diversity geographically today, why people in one place live a different way than others, which could have both biological and cultural or learned parts, but also human diversity through time. And this is where archaeology really shines in anthropology, it is the way we look at the past. Now, in this video, I want to talk about some work I did in Alaska in the summer of 2012 that links the past and the present in a way that's very important for archaeology. And this is why archaeologists and other anthropologists think this multi-field approach of physical anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and archaeology, all of which we can talk about in readings, is important. And that's because these different disciplines connect to each other. And the project I worked on in 2012 was one that took a cultural anthropological approach, meaning working with and doing what we call participant observation, that is, living daily life in the culture you're observing to help me better understand some things about the past. And so I want to just tell you a little bit about the project to give you an example of how archaeologists studying the past rely on other anthropologists for information. Now, to start, I'm going to move my photo over there. The project I worked on was in Alaska, and it was a really fun project for me. And this is part of the really cool part of anthropology and archaeology, is you get to travel, you get to meet people who maybe live different than you, you get to experience things. And this is part of what we call field work, going out and actually doing the research and collecting data. And this project was to work on a farm in a town called Palmer, Alaska. It's right next to Wasilla, where Sarah Palin lives. And work on a farm for these guys. And these are muskox. And muskox are sort of big, hairy Arctic animals. They've survived since the Ice Age. They look a little bit like buffalo, but they're actually more closely related to goats. And these are babies, so they're really cute. Playing with a ball, they actually like to do this, which if you were an archaeologist on a muskox farm, that would be maybe a mysterious part of material culture, is if you came and excavated this farm in 1,000 years, you'd find these big rubber balls that were toys for the babies. Now, my research in archaeology, when I'm studying the past, has to do with textile production, weaving. And this is a Greek vessel, a pot from somebody's house, with 2 women making fabric painted on it. This was probably a daily part of most ancient cultures. If you wanted clothing, you couldn't go down to Old Navy or Men's Warehouse or Kohl's. You had to make it in your house. Or you had to have somebody who made it. And this was something that literally everybody would have been familiar with day to day. And it was a huge driving part of ancient economies, as it is today. A huge part of our global economy, things getting shipped back and forth, the things we buy in stores, the things that companies produce and we buy are clothing and textiles and fabric. And it was just as true in the past because people still wanted to have clothing. They still wanted blankets in their houses. They still wanted tents. They wanted woven fabric. And so I study how people organize this labor. And I always tell people I study sort of the first sweatshops in the world. Now, in the past, people needed a source of raw materials. Today, we still do. We grow cotton, wool, linen. We make synthetic fibers like nylon. Well, in the past, these tended to be fibers either from plants or animals. And one of the most important animals in the place I work, which is Asia and into Europe and even into Africa, is the sheep. Sheep produce wool. So if you have wool clothing, came from one of these guys. This is a recreation, an illustration of an ancient image of some sheep. And move my image a little here. You see sheep here grow wool naturally. It's part of their biology. Modern sheep, the ones we farm, the ones almost all of our clothes come from, hold on to their wool. Like the big guy over here on the right, this is a sheep who hasn't been shorn in a few years, hasn't had his wool cut off. It doesn't fall out. It just stays. And you have to do what we call shearing, which is getting scissors, or nowadays we use something like a barber's clipper to shave them. And that's what's happening on the sheep on the left here. He's been halfway shaved to get his wool. This is an image of me actually doing this at a recreation village in Long Island, or on Long Island, shearing a sheep, collecting their wool. But this hasn't always been the way people have gotten wool. In the past, the first sheep people owned, their wool just fell out naturally. If you have a big shaggy dog that sheds all over the house, that's what ancient people's sheep did. They just kind of lost their wool. And this suggests that maybe people had to interact with those animals differently, and the whole how do we get fabric and clothing might be a little bit different. Now, very few people work with sheep like this today because it's a huge pain in the butt. Think about going around your house and collecting all of the hair your dog drops or all the hair your cat drops. And that's how you would have to go about making clothing. But I wanted to know more about this because this is something people in the past did, and people possibly where I study would have had to do. So to get this wool, you would have combed your sheep like they're doing behind me here. And all of that, like when you comb a shedding animal, a dog or a cat in your house, collects on the brush. And I wanted to go study how this impacts textile labor. And because we don't have a lot of great records of this, I looked towards what we call ethnoarchaeology. And this is taking cultural anthropology, the watching of living people, and using it to answer questions about the past. So for example, the individual in this photo behind me is a very famous person, an anthropologist. His name is Ishi, and he was a Native American in California. And he met some anthropologists and he taught them things about how to make stone tools, for example. And they were able to look at stone tools from archaeological sites and better understand them because of what he taught them. And so my plan was to find a place where we had animals who shed their fur instead of hanging onto it and study how that impacted textile production. And so I went and I found a species that did that, and it happens to be what is going on with these Arctic muskox, which are not domestic yet. So these are still wild animals, but the people working on the muskox farm in Palmer, as well as one or two other farms, are in the process of taking this wild animal and turning it into a domestic species. So think going from a wolf to a pet dog. And this is a photo of somebody combing a muskox. And the whole reason people are domesticating muskox is inspired by an anthropologist, photo here, who realized that people living in the Arctic had an economic sort of disadvantage in that they did not have an economy built on farming like much of the rest of the world. And his idea was you have two options. You could take a plant domesticated in the tropics or the warm part of the world, like corn, wheat, barley, or an animal adapted to that climate, and try to evolve it to live in the Arctic. Or you could take an Arctic animal and domesticate it. And so that was his plan, is to take an Arctic animal, the muskox, and domesticate it. They don't produce a lot of milk. From what I hear, they don't taste great. So what do you do with them? They grow wool, and they grow very nice wool. It is something valued at about $100 an ounce, partly because it's rare, but partly because it's nicer than cashmere. This is a photo of it over here on the left. And to raise these animals for their wool, so that people living in the Arctic could use that as a raw material. And so I traveled to Alaska. This is a view from right near the farm over River Valley. You beautiful mountains. This is a great area to go do field work. This is right looking up into sort of the mountains. You can see the glaciers up there on a clear day. Amazing place. This is the town of Palmer. It's a nice little Alaska town. We would come down here and drink in the bar at night. The farm is sort of just straight up this road, a little bit into the hills. Again, beautiful place. All the people who live there were incredibly friendly. Very expensive because they have to ship everything into Alaska, but an amazing place to get to work. This is down the road to the Muskox farm, and part of the reason it's there today is also they give tours, so people come and see the animals. They learn about the domestication process. They visit the farm. So there's a sign there to help people find it, and a photo of what the farm looks like. You can see those beautiful mountains in the background, the farm buildings down here, some of the fields where the muskox live. And this is when I got there in, I think, late May, early June. And you can just see how, even at that point in the year, it's still kind of brown and cold, and there's still snow on the ground. This is just a little later while I was there, and you can see the beautiful grass starting to grow. You can see the big pine trees everywhere. It's a nice place to visit. This is a satellite photo of the farm, something an archaeologist would actually use. This is from Google Earth, which is an amazingly useful tool. And it's about a 75-acre farm. And you can see a little bit here that it's divided up into different pens. This is to help control reproduction. So you have one pen with all the males in it, and then you have the pen where you want, one male to meet with a certain group of women to get the right genetics, or females to get the right genetics. Then you might have another pen when the babies are born that you keep the babies in so that they don't get into too much trouble. It's a really sort of well-organized place to control that muskox farm, the muskox herd. Here's a photo of one of them, and you can see the full shedding down the side there, just dropping on the ground. If you look around the grass here, you can see all of the sort of debris. A lot of that is that muskox wool. That $100 an ounce wool is just sitting there in the field because it falls off of them in the spring. Otherwise, they would be too hot. Here is why they have this beautiful fur, because in the winter on the farm, it is in the negative 10, 20, 30 degree weather, which is actually considerably warmer than where they really are from. They're actually from more north, usually in colder climates. So the farm is almost too warm for them in the summer. But here they are in the winter. This is why they have these big shaggy coats. And here's why they are being domesticated. Muskox can run at about 35 miles per hour. And what they like to do for defense is to hit people with that big bony ridge on their head. I actually saw this happen when I was on the farm with somebody, and it looked like they were just a rag doll thrown up into the air by this animal. So this is a really ideal way that we want to go from wild animal to domestic, is not just to change some physiological characteristics, but behavior. And so you have this mama muskox here, the babies are in the background, and then one of the farm hands is here hanging out with the muskox. This is one named Aquarius, who actually loved water, so name is very fitting. In the wild, a mother muskox would not let you get between her and the babies. They would chase you off. They would kind of herd the babies away from danger. But because these ones have become accustomed to people, they're sort of tamed, and you can come right up to them. And this is part of the reason we want to come up to them, is to harvest their wool. And you can see this little area here with a muskox and a person in it, and he's combing and picking up that wool. This is something I got to do on the farm, and it is challenging. It's like being with one of these animals in a bathroom stall. There's no room for you. They kind of move around, they step on your toes, and they weigh about 1,200 pounds. So that's really fun. It's not really fun at all. They kind of poop on you while you're in here. But again, that domestication process is in part to change their behavior. If you were in here with a wild muskox who's no familiarity with humans at all, it'd be incredibly dangerous. Here's some photos from around the farm. A little baby muskox. On the right, you have one of the big old males. One of the juveniles on the bottom left here. Here's a picture of one of the herds. Here's the mom and the babies. They're so cute. They run around and chase each other and play games. Naturally, muskox enjoy charging each other. They do it to show off. They do it to protect the herd from predators. And so the little babies play at that like it's a game. There's a photo of them. So on the farm, as a participant observer, I did the work that anybody who works on the farm. And that means a whole lot of different things that you get to see about living on a farm to help learn about what it means to take care of these animals, and to then use that to understand what we see in the past. So for example, we rebuilt what we called the crowder, which you can see here is all this construction around us. And that was something you herd the muskox into there, and the back wall would move and get them to go into the barn because they didn't like being inside. It's frightening to them. But we needed them in the barn at points to do things like weigh them or give them veterinary care. And so this was a big project we did, was the actual construction to build this. And it's big railway ties with wheels on it. And you need a set of walls that are posts that will support this when a 1,200-pound animal charges it at 30 miles an hour. We fed and herded the animals, and this is a picture of herding the animal, but it's a little baby one. We also had to do this to the big ones. Naturally, their idea when they are threatened is to run, because they know they can outrun most predators. And so even though they might be bigger or stronger than you, if you sort of charge them and act like you're big and you know what you're doing, they'll run away from you most of the time. We collected food, and some days that meant we would go to the neighbor's farm and cut down trees. And this was sort of a mutual beneficent, mutual idea between us and the neighbor farm, because the trees would grow in every summer and take over his fields where he planted hay. And so we would cut some down and help him reclaim land. We would bring the trees back, and the muskox would eat all the leaves out of them. And we would do this like 3 times a day. Drive the truck over, cut down some trees and branches, drive back. Because the muskox eat so much, they would strip out the food in their field. We had to put down hay, and this is one of the muskox rolling around in it. They look like giant puppies at times. They're just an incredibly interesting and cute animal. We took care of them, including veterinary care. So on the left, we have somebody over here working with 2 of the babies, and her job here is actually to get them accustomed to this, because we want them to know humans are okay. We want them to recognize people. So she's just hanging out in the stall with them, getting them to relax. The one behind me, this is Mandy. One morning, remember I said they like to charge things, they like to play with balls. She found a porcupine. Porcupines kind of roll up into a ball, and they have spikes, and she started pushing it around with her face. And what you see on this muskox face is a bunch of porcupine quills. So we had to come back, and this was a Saturday morning, really early. You all had to come in and help get her in there. And this is a device that sort of doesn't hurt them, but closes in the walls so they can't move too much. Used on cattle as well. And get her to stay in place so that we could take these off and clean the wounds and make sure she was okay. What actually ended up happening is we got rid of all of these, but eventually we had to call in a veterinarian because one had gotten wedged up into her hoof, and she had to get sedated and have that wound cleaned out. I'm gonna move this over. This is one of the cutest parts. We got to feed the babies, and part of how you treat them and get them used to humans is you don't take them away from the mother, but you take away some of the care the mother gives. And in this case, we did that by substituting ourselves to bottle feed them. And what you see in the top here is somebody feeding one of the babies in the pen. On the right, you can see them preparing all of the bottles for that. And this was something, once the babies sort of got to a point where they were going off milk anyway, they were eating some solid foods, we started replacing the mothers in that. Like I said, we also did construction and work around the farm. And on the bottom right here, you can see the crowder we built and these big plywood walls for the muskox to charge, because they really just love to charge things. You can see us finishing it up here on the top. On the bottom left, you can see the barn. We had to paint the whole barn. So we really did do everything that needed to get done on the farm. And so that meant putting in new fences, because the muskox would charge them and knock them over every day. We would just be at lunch one day and sitting there and look out the window and see there's a muskox wandering around the middle of the field. And it's like, that's not where they're supposed to be. And you drop your lunch and you get on your boots and you run out and you start chasing it back, because you don't want it to just like wander out onto the road. You want it to be in its pen where it's supposed to be. And we did all of this, and work continues on this farm. If you want to be actually a veterinarian, person who manages wildlife for like the National Forest, there's an entire internship program you can get here to go and work with these animals. And these are photos of some of those interns that year, the farm hands. I think the farm looks at them as sort of cheap labor as well. Harvesting wool right off of the muskox, standing there. And remember, this is $100 an ounce. So the whole process is to get this as the end goal. And this is where I really took something away as an archaeologist, thinking about the past and why people went from sheep that just drop their wool to sheep we have to spend all the time shearing. And I can tell you, having sheared sheep, they don't like it. They run away from you. They fight you while you're doing it. You have to kind of hold the sheep and make sure you don't let it wriggle around too much. They hate it. But in some ways, it's still easier. When you have a sheep that doesn't drop its wool, it's like one of us. I really need a haircut right now. That's going to be a problem until I go get a haircut. And it's the same for people who own modern sheep. Your sheep has wool until you have time to go harvest it. Can't do it today, go do it next week. It's still going to be there. With a wild species, or a species that hasn't developed that characteristic yet, like the muskox, you're on their time. You can't go harvest their wool today. Well, it's going to drop off and it's going to blow away. And that's hundreds and thousands of dollars that's blowing away in the wind. And so here, the human domestication of an animal gives us control over the schedule and the labor. It lets us make decisions about when and where we harvest the raw material we want, rather than having to be on the animal's natural schedule. And so that's an important potential change for human economies and labor. And that's part of the insight I walked away from this project with. And of course, like a lot of anthropology and archaeology, it was a great experience. I'll talk more about this when I talk about fieldwork, is that it is a, almost always life-changing and enjoyable thing to get to go do. So that was my experience working in some cultural anthropology, some of the things I got to do on the farm, a little bit of what I took away from the project. And what I want you to remember in this class is that archaeology, although we are studying the past, connects into these other realms of anthropology to try and give us a broader view. We're learning about something that happened about 3,000 years ago. An archaeologist's question should be, what can that tell us about today? Conversely, a cultural anthropologist telling people today should be able to walk over to their archaeologist colleague and say, here's what we know about people alive today. This is what it can tell us about people in the past. So that's a little bit about how anthropology fits into the four subfields, or a little bit about how archaeology fits into the four subfields of